Hey guys, welcome back. So today's find is this NorthStar generator. It is powered by a V-twin Briggs Vanguard rated at 16 horsepower. It's about 25 years old and found this one on Facebook Marketplace. The person selling it only wanted $100. According to the listing, it likely needs a carb clean and it is leaking oil. So my hope is that that's all that's wrong with it, because usually for $100, I only get things that are hopelessly broken. Anyway, as you can tell, it's pretty late. The sun set about an hour ago, and this is still on the trailer. And for one good reason. This is a pretty big machine. It probably weighs over 300 pounds. And the wheel on the other side, well, the tire is completely flat. The tube is blown out. It won't hold air. And the sidewall is actually damaged. So before I can get this up on the lift, I need to get that fixed up. So let me get set up a little bit better. We'll get this tire off the frame. We'll bring it inside, fix it up, and then we can roll this in onto the lift and get going on it. It's my favorite type of fastener here. It looks like a push nut. Those are hard to reuse. I'm hoping that I can reuse it, at least to get it inside, because this axle looks to be a 3/4 inch axle. I don't have any push nuts in stock to replace that one. No, there's no saving that one. So this is the wheel that just came off the machine, and you can see the tire, it's in pretty poor condition. It's cracked all around, and the rim isn't far behind. That said, though, we actually need to reuse this rim because the axle is 3/4 inch, and most generators are 5/8, and that's all I have at the moment. So, for now, we're going to use this tire and tube on this rim. And of course, if the machine works like it should, I'll order up a new set of wheels. These split rims are really a great thing. It makes doing this a whole lot easier. It's literally rusted to the tire. I don't have any more push nuts of the right size, so I'm hoping this hose clamp will do it for now. You know, assuming I can get a wrench in there to tighten it up. Gotta say, this thing is absolutely ginormous. It almost doesn't fit on the lift table. You know, each of these wheels, they're like half on, half off. So I did add these blocks of wood just in case one decides to jump off. We won't lose the whole machine. Anyway, I've just been looking it over. I mean, this is a very well built machine. I've actually always wanted to work on one of these NorthStars. You know, they do sell for a ton of money, brand new. This one obviously isn't new. I think it's about 25 years old and quite filthy, but it was stored in a shed. So it's actually pretty rust-free. You know, this should clean up quite well. One thing that I'm kind of questioning here is that, you know, the machine does say 10,000 ppg. I'm not sure what that means, but I don't think it's watts because the engine, although it's a V-twin, it's only rated at 16 horse. So, you know, this is going to produce about 8,000, maybe 8,500 watts, which is surprising because that generator head is like twice the length of a normal 8,000 watt generator. So I'm thinking this is going to make pretty clean power. With a V-twin, the generator is going to be running very smooth. And with something that large, I've got to imagine or hope that we're going to see some good numbers here. Anyway, I'm getting way ahead of myself. You know, we have kind of the elephant in the room, which is the oil leak. And when I went to go pick it up, you know, he was pointing right there where those paper towels are. You know, he said like 4 or 5 years ago he was running it. It was leaking quite a bit of oil. So we shut it down, hasn't run it since. He did drain the tank, which conveniently, this has 2 fuel valves. One for putting in a gas can to drain the tank when you're done, which is absolutely brilliant. I have not seen that before on a generator. And then we have another fuel valve right here, which goes to the carburetor, and that is actually cut. So we'll have to deal with that at some point. This does have electric start. I tested that battery. It is stone cold dead, so we will need a new one of those. The exhaust is crooked and quite loose. I'm actually kind of surprised I didn't lose that on the trailer on the way home. Anyway, the leak, if you look up right there, that bolt is wet and it looks like it's covered in JB Weld. So yeah, I guess the question is, where's the oil coming from? Is it coming from this housing? Is it coming from the oil filter? You know, potentially it could be coming from the crankcase cover. And actually, that kind of looks like a crack right there. Nope, just a piece of grass. So hopefully it's not the crankcase cover, because that'll be a lot of work to fix, but it is fixable without spending a ton of money. Yeah, and the rest of the machine really not that bad, you know, aside from all the dirt. This is one that I'm very tempted to power wash. But yeah, there's too many things on here that don't like water, so I am gonna pass on that. So let's check the oil. Since we have an oil leak, let's make sure we have some. I do have another battery I want to swap in there. This one wasn't much better. It was at 11 volts, so I gotta let that bake for a while, and we'll throw that in. When it's done, try to start it, just validate the engine is good, that we're making power, and hopefully the carb works. He said it likely needs to be cleaned, but since he drained the tank, you know, I'm hoping maybe he ran the carb dry. So yeah, let's wait for that battery, and I'll turn you back on in a second. It is the next day and the battery took a charge, so we should be able to try starting this, assuming we do have oil. Plenty of oil. Actually, it's over full. The full line is down there, and we're somewhere up there, so oil color is clean. Doesn't smell like fuel, but I wouldn't say it smells like oil either, so there might be a bit of contamination in there. Let's just double check. And yeah, it's over full. Just by a bit. Like, it shouldn't cause an issue. So I'm going to leave it for now, at least for testing. You know, I'm going to change out the oil in the filter once we work out the issues with this machine. Yeah, before starting something like this too, that's been sitting in a shed for a few years, it's a good idea to check the filter. This is a pretty big airbox, and you know, a critter could easily move in. Thankfully, no signs of a critter nest, and we do have a filter, so that is a good sign. Definitely not new, but fairly clean. So definitely usable. All right, we'll get this old battery out. Generally, you want to disconnect the negative first. You know, in this case, it doesn't matter because this battery has 0 juice. Anyway, the thought behind disconnecting the negative first is because the negative wire connects right to the body of the machine. So everything here is negative. And if you connect or disconnect the positive first, you know, if you touch the wrench to anything, you're going to create a pretty big spark. So disconnect the negative first, then the positive, and when reconnecting the good battery, you do the opposite. Positive first, then negative. There's a lot of corrosion on here too, so before putting the new battery in, I got to clean up these bolts as well as these terminals so we get a good connection. Put a little bit of this stuff on. It just cleans the terminals. I think it also neutralizes the acid. Just helps it last a little bit longer. Just clean this up a little while we're here. This whole bottom, it's coated with oil, which actually isn't a bad thing. It's going to preserve this metal, which is probably why there's no rust on it. And this is what I'm talking about. The negative goes from the battery right to the body of the generator, which connects over pretty much to everything else. So the engine, the frame, everything is battery negative. All right, so far so good. No sparks. None of the wires are getting hot. So let's try the electric start real quick. Beautiful. So right here and just above it is the only place I see any oil. And unfortunately, this is covered with JB Weld or something similar. So there could be a crack under there. I just can't see it. So I'm going to dry this oil completely. And, you know, when I try to start it, actually just cranking the engine might be enough to cause it to leak. But if it starts, I'm expecting or hoping it'll be obvious where this oil is coming from. Actually, let me get maybe a screwdriver, see if we can chisel off some of that JB Weld. Actually, it might be silicone. All right, think that should do it. So that silicone obviously wasn't fixing the issue. It was just kind of hiding the issue. So I'm just going to spend a minute, make sure that all the oil is mopped up. And then we'll feed some fuel to the carb, try to start it. And I'll keep you guys right here. Might be a little loud, but hopefully you can see where the oil's coming from. So it looks like the prior owner disconnected it right here at this fuel filter. And it actually runs up to a fuel pump. So feeding this from a bottle isn't going to be too practical. So I'm thinking, you know, let's just swap out this filter. It looks like it's been on there for a while. We'll put a new one on. We'll connect this to the test tank and try to start it. The fuel line actually feels good. You know, it's nice and flexible, but it is pretty dirty. I mean, this whole machine does have a layer of dust on it. So I might clean the line up, but yeah, first we gotta get this filter off. There we go. All right, I think we're pretty much ready to go. Got the external fuel tank hooked up, fuel valve turned on, but I purposely put that lower than the carburetor. So right now, that is the level mark of the fuel. And of course, we need to climb this hill, go through the filter to get to the carburetor. So by putting it like this will be a good indicator if the fuel pump is working. I've also connected a light so we can see if it makes power in the event it starts. And I'm also going to set up a camera on the other side where that oil leak is, and maybe we can catch where it's coming from. All right, let's give this a try. Circuit breakers, they're turned on. Light is plugged in, maybe turned on, and the choke, it is turned on. So we'll crank the engine, keep an eye on that fuel level. Hopefully the pump is strong enough to pump it into that carb. And no, it's not. It can only pull it up about that high, and resting position is down there. So yeah, maybe the pump just needs a little bit of fuel to kind of get some of the diaphragms in there working a little bit better. So let's help it out a bit. I'm just going to hold this above this level, and we'll crank the engine. Yeah, it's definitely advancing. There we go. So that test told me a bunch of useful information. And I guess starting with the carburetor, it is capable of running the engine. Granted, not well, it was surging, so I did have to apply partial choke. But the fact that it ran at all tells me the carb just needs a clean. It's not a complete disaster inside. The fuel pump, I think, is also good because as soon as the engine started, I put the tank back well below the level of the carburetor. And the engine kept running, actually for about 4 minutes. We'll get to that in a minute. So fuel pump is working. The engine also working quite well. No funny noises, no knocking, so the engine's good. And the generator's generating. So everything critical that needs to work is working. As far as that oil leak goes, I just took a look at the video footage from the camera that was right here. And I could see clear as day that it was the filter housing adapter that connects the filter and the pressure switch to the engine block. So swapping that out, I think, should solve the problem. And I could almost see a crack in it. in that video. So I think almost 100%, if we swap that part, the oil leak should be fixed. And apparently the prior owner thought so too, because when I went to go pick this up, he handed me a used housing that seems to be the correct part, and I've looked it over pretty carefully and I don't see any damage to it. So other than needing a good clean, I think this will solve our problem. Now, I was happy with what I saw, so I went to shut things down, and that's when I realized the switch wasn't killing the engine. I turned it to the off position a couple times actually, and nothing. I even pulled the key out and the engine kept running. So that could have been pretty dangerous. I mean, running engines inside like I do, I don't like running them for more than a minute because some engines produce enormous amounts of carbon monoxide. I have multiple detectors, and thankfully this engine actually ran very clean. So, I turned the fuel off. I actually left the area for a few minutes until the engine stalled and came back and found that no carbon monoxide was produced during that time. So the engine, thankfully, is running very clean. But before I start it again, we need to investigate what's wrong with that switch. So I'm making a list of parts I have to order, and I guess, the ignition switch is kind of a question mark because, the engine wouldn't shut down. So is it a wiring problem or is it a switch problem? So, I was getting ready to uninstall this plate and just pull the switch and wires and take a look at everything. But then I took a look over here, and there are a bunch of wires that kind of go nowhere. We have one right there. Pretty sure we have another one tucked right behind there. So I started looking at them and really paying close attention to this one right here. This is actually an insulated terminal. You see there's plastic all around it. This, on the other side, has a wire that goes to the coil. So anything that grounds this out will kill spark. And right now we have one wire connected to it, which runs under the stator and comes over to the oil pressure switch right here. So the oil pressure system can shut the engine down, but what about the switch? There's only one wire there. And then I noticed this little guy right here. It should, I would say, be plugged into there, and that likely will kill spark. So, before just plugging it in, hoping for the best, I'm just going to test with the multimeter and make sure that this grounds out when the ignition switch is turned off. So there's a couple ways we can test that wire to figure out that it is what we think it is. Probably the safest way is just the multimeter set to measure resistance. We'll do that actually first. And what we want to see here is that, if we have one wire on ground and the other one over here, when we switch the switch to off, we should see a fairly low resistance number. So I'm going to put one of the probes in there, but I'm going to use a spade because the lead on my meter actually doesn't fit in there. But if I do this, we can now kind of bridge that gap. And the other probe just needs to go on a source or ground. So the switch actually is off, which is why we see a fairly low resistance connection, about 7 or 8 ohms. I'm going to turn the switch to run, and that should go away. So we know that this is a switched ground, and that's exactly what we need right there. So that wire 100% can go there. Another way to test it would be with a test light. I've got the other end connected to battery positive. So if I touch something that's negative, it's going to light the light. So I'm going to put this switch again in the run position. So there should be no negative or ground here, which there's not. If I turn the switch to off, the light lights up. So yeah, 100%, this is what we need to kill spark. I guess the question is, why was it unplugged? And I think I have my answer. That is super loose and not grabbing on at all. So let's give that a little squeeze. We'll close those contacts a bit. And I think that problem will be solved. Yeah, I guess the question in my mind is, what are some of these other wires? You know, we have one tucked away right here that goes nowhere, and I don't see anywhere for it to go. So, you know, sometimes they just come with extra wires. You know, this engine, it's used in a lot of different applications, and just because it's not plugged in doesn't mean that it should be. So let's see if that's better. Yeah. So that problem should be solved. You know, I'm still going to pop that switch out. I just want to take a quick look at it, make sure the terminals are all clean. Someone may have been in here at some point, because I do see what looks like to be scratches right there. And this screw looks a little bit stripped out. So, yeah, just keep in mind, I mean, this engine, like the older Vanguards, they're built in Japan. And these screws, although they look like Phillips, if you look real close, there's a little dot on them, which indicate they're a JIS. So that is the screwdriver I'm using. Actually, before I take that fully off, let's just loosen this up. It does look a little bit crusty. And we also have a full-time power coming up here, so we do have to be careful not to short that out. And yeah, well, that one's pretty loose. Not sure what that one does, but like the other, it's just, you know, those terminals, they just need a little squeeze, and then that'll put some spring tension to hold that in place. So, you know, apparently that's not critical because we don't have that, or I'd say we didn't have that. And the engine still cranks without it. So that is interesting. There's also a fair amount of corrosion on the back side here. So, yeah, I think we do need to clean that mess up a bit and also fix that wire. All right, that clicked in there pretty well. Just give that a squeeze, and let's see if this one will stay on. Yeah, that's a nice connection. So most likely we are squared away. I am going to leave this off, though, for now, because to get the carb off to clean it, we actually have to pull the blower housing off. So we'll revisit this in a bit. You know, for now, though, I do want to test that the switch is working as it should. So I guess the first test would be just to make sure it still cranks, which it does. And then I'm going to attach a spark tester right to the coil wire, and I'll pull the engine over manually. When this is in the off position like it is now, we should have no spark. And when it's in the run position, we should see spark. All right, keep an eye on this right here. I'm going to turn the engine over first manually with the ignition switch on. So we should see spark, and then I'll do the same with the switch off. And unfortunately, adding that wire back didn't solve the problem. So, we've tested the switch. We've tested that it grounds out that wire, and that should kill spark if the wire is connected on the other side of this cover. So I'm just going to double check that the switch is still working to here. And if it is, then I think we need to pull a few bolts and get the cover off to see if the wire is actually connected to the coils. All right, same test. We are connected to battery positive, so this should light up whenever we ground out. Right now, the switch is in the off position, so let's see if this wire will light it. And yeah, so we have a signal to kill spark. If I turn the switch to run, which is hard to do with one hand, we lose that ground. So there's nothing wrong with the switch, nothing wrong with the wire. The problem likely is on the other side of this post. Potentially this terminal isn't making a connection to the post, so we can test that real quick, but it does look pretty clean. So I would doubt that's the issue. Yep, so I've got the multimeter set to measure the continuity, and it'll beep if we have a good connection. So one lead right to the post, the other one to the spade connector. And yeah, so there's no issue getting the ground from the spade to the post. The post goes through this insulator to the other side. So let's pull the cover and have a look at what is wrong with the other side. That bolt was pretty loose. So someone's been in here at some point. 100%. All right, we got 2 bolts off from each side. I don't think there's anything more on the top left, but the fuel pump, this bracket that holds it on, actually, I think holds on the blower housing too. So to get that off, I think we need to remove these 2 bolts that hold the pump on the bracket. And once that's removed, we can gain access to the bolts underneath, which theoretically will free this up. There's one bolt around the corner here. I don't think it's holding on. It actually looks like a separate piece, but it could be. So I'm going to remove it just to make sure. All right, so even though this was stored indoors, it was in a shed, and you can tell kind of the result of doing that. These machines, they do condensate, especially when they're cold and then suddenly exposed to humid air. So, that's why we have a lot of surface rust. It shouldn't really impact the running condition, but yeah, it's not ideal. Anyway, this is what I'm talking about right here. So we have 2 wires, it looks like, coming off of this stud. One of them runs over to this coil, and I can feel it's connected. And the other one goes up here and looks like it's chopped off or maybe chewed off. So that actually is supposed to go over to this coil. And that's the one we were just testing with the spark tester. And I can feel on the tab, there is no wire. So yeah, the fact that we fixed this isn't going to fix this coil. This one's always going to have spark without the wire connected. If I had actually tested with the tester over here, I bet that one would lose spark when we shut the engine off based on, well, what I'm seeing. You know, it is actually connected. So we do need a new wire, and I believe this wire has some diodes built in as well. So it's a, I don't want to say a specialized wire, but it is not just a wire. I think that's actually the diode right there, that little bump. So we'll add wire to the list. And at this point, I want to say I've seen enough, but I just saw something else. Let me show you. So besides the broken or chewed wire, you know, we have other evidence of a critter. This wire right here, this is the one that runs to the spark plug, has evidence that a critter has chewed on it. Thankfully, there's no wire exposed, but this is high voltage. This is thousands of volts. So, you know, the fact that some of that insulation is removed, you know, has weakened its ability to insulate. And you could get the spark jumping from here to here rather than from the plug. So this coil, I would say, should be replaced. We also have a mud dauber nest in those fins, so that has to be cleaned out. This is an air-cooled engine. This fan blows air across the heads, and if the fins are obstructed, then the engine will be damaged. Anyway, I have a pretty good idea what this machine needs now, so I'm going to place an order for all the parts that I know about, and we're waiting for that stuff to show up. I think we'll get the carb cleaned up as well as the rest of the machine. Yeah, so I was just trying to figure out what I need to order to make this issue right. And as we saw earlier, this bracket, it's broken. So there's actually a plate that goes behind the entire exhaust. It's bolted to the engine, and there's actually another support up kind of behind this pipe that's also broken. So something hit this very hard to break both of these supports. And then I noticed a bigger issue over here. This pipe goes into the pipe here for the exhaust, and it gets clamped down, and this pipe is welded on. And if I wiggle the exhaust, I think you can see that weld is completely blown out. So this exhaust, it's in bad shape. It got hit really hard, and I'm thinking this is what damaged this filter adapter right here. It must have been driven right into it and caused that crack. So, you know, this needs to be repaired or replaced. And, you know, regardless of what option we choose, we have to be able to get this off the machine. So the easiest way to do that is just to remove the bolts on each of the heads. And I already tried excessive force on that bolt and it didn't budge. So I'm thinking, let's just leave those alone and take a less direct route. You know, we should be able to slide this down and off the pipe, but we have a couple obstructions over here. We have this engine mount that's in the way, and we also have this cooling tin, which has 2 bolts down here, which I think we can get to, but there's also 2 more behind the flywheel. So as you can see, this is kind of snowballing. So we need to get the flywheel off. Should probably get the coil off over here just to make sure nothing breaks. We'll get this tin off, potentially that tin, the engine mount, and then we can finally slide this off and just kind of size up the extent of the damage here. These bolts always make me nervous. They're pretty thin, so if they're stuck, doesn't take much to break them. In this case, we got lucky. And you can see right there where the wire is supposed to connect. Even though there's nothing wrong with this coil, I have to remove it anyway. The teeth on the ring gear, they're a little bit raised. And when I try to slide this flywheel off, it's going to hang up. And the flywheel's never going to come out of there. This coil's not looking too good. A lot of rust. I think that's laminations that are peeling off. So really quite amazing, actually, that this engine's running at all. You know, it kind of makes me wonder if it was running on both cylinders. So it looks like we need 2 coils. Yeah, unfortunately, there's no threads here. So we could tap something. That would be the smart thing to do. But you can also shock it. You know, get a pry bar, apply a bit of pressure, and strike it. You have to have the nut on, though, or else you're going to mushroom out this crankshaft, and then you have big problems. So I'll try a few hits. If it doesn't come off, then we'll resort to plan B and put some threads in there. Yeah, it's definitely loose. But it's a little bit hung up on that key. Actually, I think these are tapped. There was just so much rust in there, I couldn't get a bolt in. So I think it's just a 5/16, 18. So the flywheel is loose from the tapered shaft. The problem is something's hanging it up. It could be the key. It could be a magnet behind the flywheel. There are magnets for the charging system, so potentially one of those fell off, or maybe it's just stuck, you know, magnetically to something. So the puller should get this off safely. Yeah, something's not right. So it is coming off, but now nothing rotates, which is not normal. And the resistance is increasing, so looks like it might be coming off a little bit lopsided. So I'm actually going to take the pressure off and just readjust here. It's got to be the stator. It must be toast. There we go. I'm not sure what to think. This is actually in better shape than I thought. You know, there is maybe some distortion going on right here, but nothing seems broken. And, you know, the key seems to be in good shape. Don't see any issues there. And the back of the flywheel looks pretty good. All the magnets are there. Ton of debris in between, so maybe that was it. So I'm going to spend a second just clean out the debris and maybe sand some of this rust off. It might have just been rubbing, you know, against here, making it difficult to remove. So let me just spend a second, clean this up, and see if we have a bigger problem or if it's just a bunch of junk. Let's try fitting this without the key. Still needs to be cleaned more, but I think it's good enough that we can get an idea as to what's going on here. So, yeah, no problem. So it was just all the dirt that was making it, I guess, zero clearance between the magnets and the stator. But, you know, even with this quick clean, flywheel goes right on. So with this out of the way, we might have enough room to kind of drop this off without pulling anything else. And yeah, I think we're going to be able to only because that weld is broken. So if we repair the weld or get a new exhaust, I'm not sure we'll be so lucky, but it looks like we are off. So let's just get this bracket removed. Looks like we got one bolt holding the whole thing on. There's got to be more than that. Oh yeah, there's one down there too. So 2 bolts, this plate will come off, and we'll try to get these broken bracket bolts out as well. Yeah, let's see if we can get these out. You know, worst case, even if they break, we should be able to get a nut right in there. So it's not super critical that they come out in one piece. The other thing I noticed too is that the broken weld, it's only broken on this side. It's actually not broken back here. So, you know, I'm thinking I'm going to try to fix that. I don't have the best welder, and I certainly don't have much in the way of welding skills. But if I don't weld it, then it's trash. If I weld it and mess it up, then it's trash. So I have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And maybe I'll fix it, or worst case, I'll at least learn what not to do next time. All right, that one came out. Two for two. That one might be a number 12. And it looks pretty crusty. And this really doesn't matter. You know, if we break the bolt, we just buy a new bolt. You know, it's not like it's in the engine block. And it came right out. Huh. Yeah, so actually more than half. It starts right there. It actually goes up around the corner, comes all the way around right to there. So about 3/4 of it ripped off. So this stuff is pretty thin, pretty rusty. So welding it, yeah, maybe it'll work. I'm sure it'll work if you're good enough. Nope. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. So the welder, it's on one of the lowest settings I can set it. I'm going to bring it down a tiny bit more, but yeah, I think that hole is going to cost us. Well, despite the bad start with the hole I blew in it, I actually think it came out pretty well. You know, that pipe is secured in there real good, way better than it was before. So I was getting ready to sand the whole thing and just add some paint to it. And then I held it like this. You know, I'm not sure how well it shows up on camera, but that pipe is kind of going off to the left, just a bit. And I'm not sure if that's how it's supposed to be. So I tried taking a look online of some new exhaust systems, and it looks like it does have a slight bend to it, but I think this one is worse than it's supposed to be. So when I welded it initially, you know, I held this pipe up and kind of aligned where the brake was and just tacked it in place and then finished the weld. But I'm thinking, you know, it's still off, and likely it's because, you know, the damage to the exhaust, I think, is right here. It looks like it's punched in, and that most likely tweaked kind of the alignment of the pipe. So, you know, I could heat this, beat it into submission, and probably get it to fit. But I've already spent a ton of time on it. And to be honest, a new one of these, you know, it's not dirt cheap, but it's not that expensive either. So I'm thinking, you know, let's just do it right and get a new one. So I am going to order one of those up. And I guess the concern is the exhaust manifold could be bent as well. And, you know, maybe this isn't the problem. So I don't really know until I get that exhaust system. Hopefully that manifold is okay, because it's really stuck on there. So for now, you know, let's move on. Let's get that oil adapter off, and we'll clean up the replacement and get that ready. So there is still some oil in the engine block. I haven't drained that yet, but the level should be below right here. So I'm not too worried about losing a bunch other than just what's right here. So we'll start by getting the filter off, which looks to be original, or at least pretty old, judging by the rust on it and the fact that it won't come off. Wow, that is on there. Yeah, that has not been off in a long time. So we'll get this wire unplugged, and then looks like we got a total of 3 bolts. So the oil, I think it's getting through right there, and that kind of makes sense because that passage aligns with this area right here, which is where we saw the oil coming from. You know, from the outside, it's not as clear where that crack is, but yeah, that has to be the source of the problem. Yeah, and you can see the prior owner was definitely in here too. I'd say he replaced the gasket. And of course that didn't work. Just a ton of RTV on here, which you shouldn't need, you know, if things are working right. So this gasket actually isn't too bad other than the RTV. But we'll get a new one of these just to make sure. So I just taped this up to keep some of this junk out of the engine. So I think since we're here, let's get some of this grime off this machine. Yeah, it's amazing how much dirt is on this machine. For something that was stored indoors, I guess some of it had to do with that oil leak. Everything had a little layer of oil. Some dust settled on it and just made it stick real good. Anyway, you don't need to watch this whole thing. I'm not trying to get it perfect, but I do want to get off kind of all the heavy stuff. Make it more presentable. It's cleaning up pretty well, but I think I'm going to switch gears here. I'll do the rest of the cleaning kind of off camera. Really, the last big thing here to look at is the carburetor. So to remove it, we just need to get the airbox off. Should be a few bolts underneath. And the carb, it's actually held onto the intake manifold by 2 bolts, one on the front and one on the back. Back one is not accessible, so you actually have to take the entire intake manifold off. 2 bolts on each side, and then it just comes out as one piece. Yeah, I don't remember on the breather if that stays with the airbox or if we have to remove it from the airbox. Guess we'll find out. looks like it's been some time, if ever, that this has been cleaned. So I want to get this intake manifold fully off, and unfortunately the way they made it, you can't get a socket or even the closed end of a wrench on there. You have to use the opened end, which isn't great. Yeah, it doesn't grip it too well, and it can certainly strip out. And that is also super tight. There we go. All right, that one's loose. Let's try the rusty one. Doesn't feel good, but it's turning. And I definitely want to be careful with this carb. They do still make it. Last time I looked, I think it sold for somewhere between $200 and $300, depending upon where you look. So, yeah, you don't want this carb to go bad. That gasket came off clean. So we now need to remove the top of the carb. Or actually, before I do that, there is a drain right here. So we'll get that bolt removed. We'll drain it out. That's actually the access to the main jet as well, if you want to remove it. I don't recommend it because I've tried on every single one of these I've worked on, and none of them have come out. The only thing I've managed to do is strip them. So they don't actually need to come out. You can actually clean it in the carb. No, the JIS screwdriver, it feels like it's going to slip. So I might need a pair of vice grips to get this one out. Let's try that though. It seems to fit pretty well. Yep. There's one. Two for two. Okay, not much in there because we ran it dry. We had no choice. So the top is kind of glued on with a huge gasket that's in there. So we're going to have to tap on it quite a bit usually to break it free. And then once we're in, we should be able to see what we're dealing with here. All right, place your bets. Yeah, a lot of junk in there. And the smell is very bad. So this, I would say it was not empty when it was sitting around. You know, there's a ton of junk down there and just a really, really strong smell of bad fuel. So we have a pilot jet right there. The main jet, can't really see it too well, but it's through that hole. I'm not even going to try to take that one out. I think I'm just going to make sure it's clear, and yeah, then I think we'll be good. There we go. This one had me a little worried. This screwdriver, it's not a good fit. It's a little too narrow, and everything else I have is too wide. So ideally you would get a tool that fits properly, because these brass pieces here, they chip off really easily. So that is the pilot jet. It does look clogged, so that would cause the run issue we were seeing. And the rest of it certainly isn't great. So the main jet I know isn't plugged, but I could see it easily getting plugged up given all the debris. So I'm just going to scrape some of this stuff out, probably use some carb cleaner to get the chunks out, and then we'll just soak it for a bit in the ultrasonic. Yeah, likely we're going to have to get a new gasket as well. It came off clean. I could just put it back on. It should be fine. But there's a lot of junk underneath it. So we need to get it off to clean this properly. Yeah, that was plugged. And so was the side passage. It's only been 5 minutes, and it's a pretty big difference already. So I'm going to give that, I'd say, at least another 10 or 15 minutes, and I think we should be good. Carb cleaned up pretty well, both inside and out. So considering where we started, I think this should run pretty well. Now there is some staining due to corrosion on the aluminum, but that shouldn't impact how it runs. There's nothing too severely damaged. You know, it's more cosmetic than anything. So we'll get this back together, starting with the bowl drain. And then we can put the pilot jet in. Okay, and then the needle in the float. And this can be a little tricky on this one to align not only the needle in the seat, but you also have to get this piece vertical at the same time. Like that. So the carb, really not much more to it other than to throw the gasket on and bolt the cover on, but I'm not going to do that yet. You know, although this gasket may be reusable, you know, I'm not going to try. You know, this gasket, it's critical that it seal or else the carb isn't going to work properly. So I'm going to get a new one of these ordered up before I finish putting this together. Yeah, I've been looking things over pretty carefully, just trying to make sure that we don't need to order anything else. You know, we have a pretty long list and it seems to be ever growing. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to add a few more things to the list. You know, there was at some point a mouse in here. It caused damage to this coil as well as the other one. And the flywheel, very hard to get off. You know, I could tell that there was some distortion down there on the stator. And now that I'm looking at it more carefully, I can see that this metal ring on the inside, down on the bottom here, it is all corroded out and the plastic's actually blown out. So I think that's why the flywheel was hung up. You know, the stator is damaged due to the critter. And to that end, I found a little bit more critter damage. We have an anti-surge spring right here that is in two pieces. So we need to add that to the list as well as a new stator. So, you know, at this point, there's not a whole lot more I can do without parts. You know, I'm thinking, you know, maybe we check the valves. This is a 25-year-old engine, and likely they are out of spec. So let's pop the valve covers off real quick. We'll double check those, just clean up the covers, and get this back together. So there's not a whole lot more we can do until parts start showing up. But I do want to check the valve clearance. You know, this engine's about 25 years old, and boy, that plug is tight. There we go. And I was going to say, likely the valves haven't been checked or adjusted. So Briggs calls for between 4 and 6 thousandths on each valve. So I'm getting the plug out just so we don't have compression fighting us when we rotate the engine to set the valves. And that plug looks really bad. So a lot of white corrosion there, and it looks like rust. So that is not a good sign. I'm tempted to stick the Borescope in there, but I'm not sure I want to see what's in there. And just for comparison, this is the plug on the other side. It looks like it was lean. We got a white strap right there. And this is the plug on this side. Yeah, not good. So I would say we need a new plug for sure. Probably just replace both while we're at it. And I think I am going to take a peek in there with the Borescope because this is concerning. So let's take a look with the Borescope, but I think I already know that this engine is junk. The plug looked terrible, so I'm thinking we're going to see a lot of rust in here and most likely a piston that doesn't work. And yeah, look at that. Ton of rust. I think that's the cylinder wall kind of on your bottom right. And straight down, that is the piston. Looks like potentially a mark on it, like maybe it hit the valves. And can't really see a whole lot more. So let's switch to one of the side cameras. So now we have the side camera turned on. It's kind of hard to make anything out, but that does not look good. I think that is the cylinder wall. You know, if I look up, that should be the head. Maybe we'll see a valve. Yep, there's a valve. But yeah, look at this. I mean, it's just covered in rust. So yeah, we have a dead cylinder, and by dead, I mean completely dead. So this just went from a repair video, I think, to a teardown video. All right, well, this one, it's been throwing me curveballs since I got it, and I think I just struck out. So instead of a repair video, we're now changing gears to a teardown video. We're going to take a look at the internals of this engine and just see how bad the damage is, which kind of surprises me because the engine, when we had it running, actually sounded good. At least that side did. You know, this side was doing nothing. And unfortunately, I don't think it's ever going to do anything again because the cylinder is severely rusted. I'm sure the piston is stuck. Most likely the valves are damaged and stuck as well. So this engine is a total loss. And, you know, so far I've invested probably about $300 in this. You know, $100 for the purchase price, about $200 for the parts I already have en route to get this machine back up and running. That said, though, some of those parts can be returned. The rest of them can just be sold. And the parts on this machine are quite valuable. You know, that carburetor alone should pay for really my entire investment so far in this machine. And of course, there's a lot of other parts on here that can be salvaged. So I'm going to start just by getting the oil out and probably the battery removed as well. And then we'll start breaking this thing down. We need to get everything kind of external to the engine off. And then I want to start by getting this head off first so that we can take a look inside with our own eyes just to see how bad the damage is. So what do you think the odds are of these breaking free as opposed to just breaking? Hey, actually, that spun pretty easy. Let's try the other one. Nope, closed end isn't going to fit. There we go. That was pretty loose. Surprised it was working at all. And so is that one. We'll get the dipstick out of the way. We don't need to remove it yet. Really, I'm just after all this bracketry up above. All right, let's rotate the engine, see if the valves are opening. And surprisingly, they are. So, yeah, as bad as it looks in the cylinder, the head may not be a complete loss. I need to get the rockers off to access the head bolts here on either side. There's also 2 down here. So I think there's just 4 in total. Yeah, did I mention someone's been in here before? The push rod on the exhaust side, that is aluminum. That's supposed to be on the intake side. The steel push rod is what should be on the exhaust side. So, yeah, someone's done something in here before, and they put the push rods in the wrong spot. Yeah, it's incredible the amount of damage to this cylinder. I don't think I've seen one ever in this kind of condition. So this piston, I'd say, has no chance of ever moving again. So I guess the question in my mind is, how did this happen? You know, was the engine running? It threw a rod and just nobody noticed? Or I'd say more likely this was sitting in a shed, a mouse moved in and caused the damage we see here. You know, at some point the owner realized that the engine wasn't rotating and probably barred it over with extreme force until things started to move, not realizing that the internals were broken. And can't say I blame him. You know, we ran this earlier and the engine actually sounded good. So I could see how he maybe thought it was fine. You know, of course, we would have got there eventually when we did the load test, because this would have fell way short of its rated wattage. It would have been about half. Anyway, before I continue the engine breakdown, you know, we need to get the generator uninstalled. It's quite large, quite heavy. We actually have a hook there to assist with the removal, so we might need to use that. But before we get this off, we do need to disconnect all the wires, get the control panel and the fuel tank out of the way. Yeah, surprisingly, the oil looks pretty good. You know, there's no metallic in there, no metal flakes. You know, if I didn't know better, I'd say we have a healthy engine. Of course, I know better, and this thing needs to come apart. So to that end, I think this is going to be a lot more difficult than I originally thought. You know, I was thinking just remove the tank. That would give me the access I need to the top of the stator, but that's not the case. The heat shield is actually part of the frame, so removing the tank isn't going to give us access to the top of the stator, but I think it will give us access to a couple bolts holding this control panel in place. So the tank has to be removed anyway so we can free this up. And then of course we can't get that out until we disconnect the wires. And that brings us to the next problem, because the wires are usually going into the end housing on most generators, but that's not the case with this one. We actually have that on top under this cover. And the cover is held in place by a couple of tiny little rusted bolts going into corroded aluminum. So I don't give those much of a chance of coming out. And even if they do, I'm not sure we have the clearance to get that cover out of there. So instead, maybe we just open up the control panel, disconnect the stator from this end, then that control panel will be free to come out. Another unique design on this generator, the tank is usually held on by bolts up above. In this case, we have the bolts underneath. I'm going to try these crusty ones while we're here. If I plan on reusing this power head in the future, I want to make sure I have access to this because the capacitor is under there. Huh. Did that round out immediately? Wow, that came right out. Yeah, it's good to see actually that it's fairly corrosion free in here. It's just a little bit dirty, but overall not too bad. Anyway, we need to get these 4 wires disconnected that come up from the stator. We have a white and a green, which come over here, so that's easy enough to remove. And then we have the 2 black wires, which are leg 1 and leg 2, and they come over to the main breaker. To get these off, we either need to cut them or just remove the 4 screws from the front of the panel, and we actually have to pull the breaker out before we can get access to release the wires. stator and the rotor, they look good. No signs of problems. A little bit dirty, but yeah, it's in pretty good shape. So, you know, we are pretty much home free at this point. We just need to remove the bolts that hold the stator to the mounts, and then we have just 4 Allen bolts right here going around. Once those are removed, theoretically, we can get a puller on here and separate the stator from the ball bearing, and it should slide right out. They are tight. They're tighter than a head bolt. I'm guessing there's some thread locker on here, so I might apply some heat and see if that loosens it up a bit. You know, the bolt, it's spinning, but it's not coming out. So I'm thinking maybe there's a nut on the back side here. So this is removable. So let's get these screws out, and hopefully there's just a nut that's spinning, which is why that's not coming out. Yep. Ooh, that one's the tightest of the lot. Oh, there we go. So I've got that piece of wood just taking most of the weight off of the mounts here. So that way there's no friction kind of fighting us, breaking the stator free. So I'm going to use this 3-jaw puller and just apply light pressure. You know, this aluminum, it breaks easy. This stuff looks a little thicker than most. Plus we don't have any cutout for brushes. So it can take a little bit more, which we might need because there's just so much corrosion on here. I'm willing to bet the seal between the stator and the bell housing is probably pretty tight. All right, so I'm going to stop right there. There's a lot of pressure, and there's absolutely no movement. So I'm going to tap around here and see if we can get it to break free. There we go. It's starting to move. Maybe. Yeah, so I dropped the lift down close to the floor, so that way we don't have far to go with that stator. So this bolt, it's a little bit too thin to kind of do this the quick and easy way, which is just turning this end most of the way and then striking it with a 3-pound hammer. And that usually shocks it off the tapered shaft. You know, in this case, the bolt diameter, it's about a little bit over 3/4 of an inch, about 7 millimeters. And if I start striking this, it's just going to pretzel the bolt, and then we're in trouble. So the safest way is to use hydraulic pressure to push this off. You know, you can use grease if you want to put a grease zerk there. You know, what I usually do is just use water. We do need to put threads here. There are none here, but once we have threads, we'll take the bolt, put Teflon on it, and then fill the shaft with water. And then we just tighten down the bolt, builds up pressure, and hopefully pops the rotor off the tapered shaft. So the closest tap is an M10 1.5, which thankfully I have. It's the same that's required on most power mates. So the reason I tip this up is so that I can get all the air out of the shaft. If there's any air in there, it's going to act as a spring, and we're not going to build pressure. At least not enough to separate the rotor from the shaft. So we will fill this to the top, make sure all the air is out, and then put a bunch of Teflon on a bolt. Usually takes a few attempts, but this usually works quite well. There we go. That was almost too easy. Yeah, this one came off without a fight. Usually the rotor puts up the fight and the stator slides right off. In this case, it was kind of reversed. The rotor came off with little effort, and the stator was a bit more work, but not too bad. So we've got both the stator and the rotor off. We didn't cause any damage. So I think we can reuse this in the future, but it might be some time because the tapered shaft that's on here, it is pretty unique. You know, I don't think I've seen one like it before. You know, Honda clones don't use it, Hondas don't use it, Subaru, Yamaha, and just regular Briggs, they don't have this type of tapered shaft. So if we wanted to reuse that generator head, you know, most likely we're going to have to find another Vanguard engine, which I actually did a couple hours ago. It was exactly the same model and type, you know, part for part. So I was going to get it, but I wanted to make sure this tapered shaft was the same as the one that was being sold, and it is. Unfortunately, I just took another look, and in the last couple hours, it's now marked sold. So yeah, maybe at some point there'll be a part 2 on this, and I actually would like to do a part 2 because, you know, this I think is going to be in the top 5 as far as clean producing generators go. You know, just the sheer size, the fact that I think it's copper, and if you look at the rotor, you know, it kind of looks like it's twisted. And that's done on purpose. That actually creates a cleaner sine wave and lower THD. So just another sign that this is a high-end generator and likely below 5% THD. Anyway, we are almost done. Let's get the final head off, then we'll take the engine off the frame and finish it up. Well, like the other side, the rockers look to be in good shape. Maybe even a little bit better shape, because the other side we did have a bit of exhaust blow-by coming through. Oh, those are tight. So we'll get both of these rockers out of the way, and then we'll have access to all the head bolts. It looks like the same issue over here. So aluminum push rods on the exhaust side and the steel is on the intake. So as far as I know, that is backwards, 100%. Well, no surprises here. The piston, it moves, and the cylinder looks to be in very good condition. You know, I don't see any damage, no vertical scoring to speak of, so minimal wear on this side of the engine. And the head, equally in as good a shape. You know, just minimal carbon buildup that would clean up pretty easily. So, you know, we have one cylinder that's in really good condition and another one that's, well, the opposite of good. And I'm kind of doubting how this happened because, you know, there's really only two ways moisture could get in here, either through the exhaust or through the intake. And the exhaust, it's well below the level of the cylinder. So I don't think that is how it got in. The intake was up here, so certainly anything that gets in there can work its way into the cylinder. But the airbox looked great. You know, no signs of damage on the air filter, no evidence of a critter, no rot to the airbox, no nesting material. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of still scratching my head as far as what caused the damage over here. You know, regardless, we see the result. So let's get the final 2 bolts off holding this engine to the frame and get it opened up. So we broke the seal, but I do need to sand this rust off because the cover, likely it's going to hang up trying to get over that ridge of rust. All right, let's give it a try. We are so close. It's probably 1/4 inch from being free, but it's not. And yeah, I probably should have pulled the oil seal to be able to clean the rust off of there. So let me see if I can get this back in. We'll pull the oil seal, clean it up a little better, and try this again. All right, let's try this again. Now that we've cleaned it up better without the oil seal, it'd be nice if it would just slide right off. There we go. Yeah, I think that's important. Interesting. It usually comes off in multiple pieces. In this case, literally the rod just broke off from the bottom end. We have a couple other chunks down here, but really not as much shrapnel as you normally see in a blown up engine. So this is the cam up here. We can probably time it to assist with its removal. Yeah, so the timing, it is a tooth off, but I think that's from what I did. When I initially opened this, I opened it enough to kind of release these gears from meshing, and likely when I closed it back up, it just was not in the right position, so I'm not too concerned about that. We know the timing was good because the engine ran. So this is the cam, and the lifter's falling out. The cam looks to be in excellent condition. That right there, I would say, is the decompression system on just one of the lobes. Yeah, the cam looks to be in really good shape, and the governor is actually part of the cam. Very interesting design. Ooh, that one was loose. Almost finger tight on that side, so this engine was not going to hold together for much longer. Looks good. Besides, you know, the damage it took on the outside, journal looks to be really good. Yeah, did I mention this cylinder looks to be in really good condition? If you look carefully, you can see the crosshatch still in it from the factory. So this side had minimal wear. You know, I'd say this engine was a low hours engine, but that doesn't really answer the question as far as what happened over here. You know, as far as the crankshaft goes, it's not in great shape. There is a lot of damage to this journal, the one that had the connecting rod on it that failed, and it's not the usual damage I see. Usually, if these run out of oil, there's a lot of aluminum transfer that happens. So it actually builds up the material. You know, in this case, it steps down. It's actually removed material, like there was an abrasive caught between here. So that is not something I can fix. A machine shop could. You know, they could redo this journal. We could find a connecting rod that fits it. But given we have no crankcase to put it in, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. So likely this is scrap. The piston, it's in very good shape. The skirts have virtually no wear on them, and the rings, they're not stuck. So the piston is good. The connecting rod, not great. You know, the journal doesn't look terrible, but there is a bunch of damage to the outside of that rod caused when the other one let go. So that should not be reused. The camshaft is in excellent condition. So is the cover. And the oil pump, I'm sure it works, but given what we see here, I'm not sure I would trust it. So yeah, we have some usable parts here. You know, the crankcase surprisingly looks good as well. Usually when the connecting rods let go, it punches a hole in the block. And in this case, I only see a little bit of damage. So if it wasn't for the fact that we have a bad cylinder, which is part of the block, theoretically this could be reused. But the more I look, you know, I do see some damage right there, the bottom of the cylinder. And that one looks better, but there is a little damage right there as well. So, yeah, This, unfortunately, it is scrap. So you can't win them all. I was about to make this into a 2-part video after adjusting the valves. The second part would have been making everything right. And of course, that's right when I discovered this problem right here. So yeah, this one, not ending on a happy note, but we do have a lot of good parts, and we do have a really good generator that we can use at some point. So my hope is in the future we can find another Vanguard like the one that failed here and repower this. But until that happens, I think I'm done. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching. All right, not quite done yet. As soon as I turned the video off, I went to Facebook Marketplace looking for a suitable V-twin Vanguard to repower this, and came up empty for the most part. The closest one was 250 miles away, and it didn't look to be in very good shape. But what I did find was another NorthStar. So this one, also like the other, only $100. It has issues, so there will be another NorthStar video very soon. Okay, now I'm done.